Welcome, everybody, both newcomers and people who were here before. It's a pleasure to have you, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce our next speaker in the What is Belief series, Linda Skitka. Linda is a professor of psychology at University of Illinois at Chicago. She did her BA and MA in psychology at University of Michigan and her PhD at Berkeley. Her focus is on social, political, and moral psychology, and she studies such topics as moral conviction, moral courage, and avoiding political bias, among many other topics. We're very pleased to have her. As before, we are generously supported by the John Templeton Foundation, and we're thankful to them for making this possible, and thankful to all of you, of course, for being here. So please virtually welcome Linda Skitka with me. And Linda, go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here today, and I'll be very interested in the feedback that I get. I also just want to say welcome to so many people who I briefly noticed in the audience. I see we've got people coming in from a variety of different places in the world, which is so totally cool. One of the major silver linings of the pandemic has been, I think, our ability to connect so much more broadly than we once were able to. So I'm going to be talking to you about moral convictions. And really this one starting point for this line of work is the basic question of what is morality? I'm still kind of puzzled. For the last 15 or so years, morality has been a really popular topic. So we see tons of papers that claim to be about morality, but very few that ever define what morality is. So what is morality? And one question is it an inherent judgment of some issues or judgments, which seems to be implicit in a lot of the work that is on morality? For example, the trolley problem seems to be accepted by many people as just as a quintessential prototype for studying moral decision making. But if you take a step back, well, is it? Or who says it is? And so an alternative question is morality more of a meta-perception that some perceivers have about certain issues, judgments, or choices? And it's not only the trolley problem that gets kind of lumped into it's a moral thing, particularly in social and political psychology issues. Many issues are assumed to be moral issues. Okay, with no defining criteria of what makes some issues moral and other issues not. And so, for example, some studies would study a pair of issues, for example, abortion or same-sex marriage in a given election cycle, and compare them to presumed non-moral issues, such as the Iraq War, on the other side. And like, who said the Iraq War wasn't necessarily a moral issue? And are issues like abortion and same-sex marriage universally seen as moral issues? So we've been studying whether, in fact, morality might be a meta-perception that people attach to some issues and not other issues. So people might be able to answer the question, what is my attitude about X? Let's use the target issue of abortion. And they could, define themselves as either supporting or opposing legalized abortion. But they can also have a perception about that perception. Okay, what do I feel about my attitude about X? So how do I feel about my support for abortion rights, for example? And some people might actually feel, well, this is a deeply held moral conviction, whereas other people might not. If morality is in fact a meta-perception, okay, a belief about another belief or an attitude about another attitude, then a number of things should be true. We should find individual differences in moral conviction, even with respect to normatively moral issues. Okay, not everybody will see these putatively moral issues as in fact moral. We should also see that moral convictions on issues should be temporally variable, that at one time people may or may not have seen the same issues in a moral light. You could also talk about the degree to which people attach moral convictions to attitude objects should also be comparatively universal, that everyone everywhere should see the same issues in a moral light, and so on. So that's one set of questions, okay, is is morality indeed an essential feature of some judgments, issues, or choices, or in fact, is it more variable than that? Is it more of a feature of the perceiver than necessarily the perceived? And if there's in fact variance there, okay, in the degree to which people attach moral significance to some putatively moral issues, then it becomes interesting to start to explore whether, for example, there's anything distinct about morally convicted attitudes than other kinds of attitudes. And so this is kind of a case study in the degree to which there's variability in issues that people tend to see moral. Abortion in the United States for a good number of years has just been seen as kind of a classic moral dilemma. But it implies that it's always been seen as a moral dilemma or a moral issue. And it hasn't always been seen that way in the United States. In fact, it wasn't until around the 1860s that moralized language started to be used when discussing the morality of abortion. And up until that time, women were legally free to terminate a condition that might turn out to be a pregnancy until it was confirmed by fetal movement. So up to about 4 months, it was considered perfectly acceptable. It was also considered above the law and not a crime. There were lots of home manuals and instructions on how to do abortions. They were very openly advertised in newspapers, maybe under pseudonyms, but everybody knew what the pseudonym stood for. And up until that time, they were also typically offered by midwives. It was not until actually an increasingly professionalized medical community started really competing with midwives and homeopaths that, in fact, abortion started to get a bit of a moral status. It was an attempt to actually control the market more completely on providing healthcare services and to drive midwives and homeopaths more out of business. And even then, it took years before people really started to formalize anything in a really big, significant way. For example, when Roe v. Wade was decided in 1974, interestingly, by a largely conservative court. So even one of the issues that at least we in the US see as a quintessentially moral one has considerable historical but variability. And I think most of us are aware that abortion is not seen as such a moral issue in most other places of the world. That the US has uniquely moralized abortion in some ways. South America would be another one that has traditionally has heavily moralized it, but a great number of other places do not, for example, China. And then there's also public opinion data that shows actually rather dramatic changes in people's perceptions of the moral acceptability and unacceptability of a whole host of different kinds of things. For example, since 2001, there's been a 23-point change in people's attitudes about the moral acceptability of gay or lesbian relations. The same thing with having a baby out of wedlock, their approval of sex between unmarried men and women, and so on. And it doesn't always go in one more direction. Not all things become more morally acceptable over time. Things that have been seen as more morally unacceptable over time have been using the death penalty and medical testing on animals. So we're seeing both historical, here actually with considerable historical variation in the degree to which people see many given issues in a moral light. So again, this begs the question to me anyway, of who defines what is or not moral, especially as we study it in moral psychology. In the vast majority of cases, it's the researcher or theorist who's defining what counts as morality. Moral foundations theory would be one example of that, as is Kurt Gray's dyadic model of morality. So they come up with some broad definition about basically what's supposed to count as morality, and then they go out and do research to see how people behave and whether they're consistent with the theory or not. But I think an equally interesting approach would be to do a bottom-up or data-driven approach. Instead of the researcher coming with preconceived notions about what is and is not going to be counted as a moral decision, for example, is this asking people to what degree do they see a given issue, choice, or dilemma in moral terms, and then trying to find out what are the defining characteristics that lead them to define something in moral terms. And to a considerable degree, that's what my program research has been about for the last 15 to 20 years. And from that, from more of an inductive basis rather than deductive basis, we have come up with a number of characteristics that help define the moral domain. Some of this is consistent with Triel and Nucci's developmental theory of morality that was developed in the 70s. And it allows us to actually think about different kinds of attitudes. That in social psychology, we largely think of different kinds of attitudes as attitudes that vary in dimensions of strength, where those are defined in terms of evaluative extremity, personal importance, centrality, identity, cognitive accessibility, and so forth. But all those characteristics of strong attitudes are content-free. They're talking about the structural property of attitudes, but not really what the attitudes are about. Whereas domain theory actually sorts attitudes originally, when it was originally proposed, judgments into 3 bins. One bin is preferences. Okay, preferences are attitudes that are that most of us see in terms of matters of taste, and we certainly see our personal attitude on it as a matter of taste. They're subjective and comparatively tolerant. This could refer to broccoli, for example, whether you do or do not like broccoli, and it's okay that we understand that that's subjective, and we're not going to shun people who don't share a position on broccoli. However, abortion attitudes can also fall into this bin as well. Someone might have a preference, for example, that abortion be legal without having any conventional or moral imperative baggage on top of that preference. They may just simply want a backstop birth control method should everything else fail. So they're going to personally see that as a matter of preference. For them, it's, again, subjective. It's okay if you have a different attitude on abortion than they do. And so it's also comparatively tolerant. Whereas other people's attitudes or other kinds of attitudes can be rooted more in conventions. These tend to be more normative standards or beliefs and coordination rules between groups. For example, we were talking about Tanya being in Australia. In the US, we drive on the right-hand side of the street. We can even use language like right and wrong to describe driving on the right hand of the street. But we understand that that's just a coordination rule. That in Australia, people drive on the left side of the street. Okay, so the right and wrongness to this is only that it's conventionally right or wrong, and that it violates a coordination rule that allows us to get along. It's not written in, it's not some kind of moral imperative. These tend to be really reliant on authorities or peers, saying what's right or wrong, for example, often codified by law, but they're narrow. They apply to people within this group, okay? And it's relatively tolerant of people outside of the group. You could even say, again, an attitude on abortion might be rooted more in conventionality. For example, people in my faith community do not support abortion, and so I don't either. And this would be really defined by authority in terms of, or peers, okay, people within the group. Somebody who has a genuinely conventional attitude about morality will generally be pretty tolerant of people outside of that individual community, that we understand people in other groups might have different norms about abortion or other kinds of issues. The interesting thing about attitudes that are going to be in this domain is if peers or authorities were to change their position on it, the perceiver would often change their position on it as well. And then we have the domain of moral imperatives. Okay, and now a couple of these in here that I have as characteristics are, are theoretical. So much of it's derived by moral philosophy, but some of it's actually empirical. And I'm just going to share with you right at the get-go that we have found empirical evidence supporting each of the characteristics that I have in the moral imperative bin. And that is that people tend to see them as moral absolutes or universals. It's not only right or wrong in my community, it's right or wrong for other communities as well. And keep in mind, this is a perception. This is an attitude about which I think everybody should universally agree. and that I feel strongly about and as confident about is 2 + 2 = 4. Again, I perceive it in a related vein that I see it as akin to a fact, to the point where if I actually ask you why you have that attitude, it's really pretty irritating. It's like it's so obvious to me about what's right or wrong in this particular instance. To explain it feels really weird. It's very authority independent. Okay, and this is one of the really defining characteristics of the moral domain from the conventional domain, is that you really don't care what authorities have to say about the matter, okay, or what the rule of law is. You know the right answer in this particular case. It has really interesting and deep ties with emotion. But the emotional story is a little complicated, which is something I'll be getting into. It's motivating. Okay, having this belief creates a sense of strong obligation to act on the belief. Okay, that you need to defend attitudes that you see as moral imperatives. They're very resistant to change and are comparatively immune to things like majority influence or normative influence, and they're very intolerant. That you do not tolerate people who do not share your moral convictions. So some of the research that really led us to dial in on the idea of moral convictions as meta-perceptions, and then also what the defining characteristics of what those kinds of perceptions were. And we kind of started out with social distance. Okay, that one premise of what we think moral convictions might be is that they're intolerant. Okay, so we asked a community sample, what do you think is the most important problem facing this country today? We also asked them the degree to which they perceive this attitude as strong. Basically, it has the characteristics of evaluative extremity, importance, and centrality, to rule those out as alternative explanations. We used a single face valid item about moral conviction. How much are your feelings about whatever their issue was connected to your core moral beliefs and convictions? We have 5 items that work out really well, but their inner reliability is like alpha equals 0.99. It really almost doesn't matter how you ask about whether it's moral convictions, but we feel very strongly about not confounding it with other characteristics of attitudes, such as importance, centrality, or the defining features of, theoretical features of morality, such as authority, independence. Those are testable hypotheses, not top-down theories about what these are. We then asked a social distance measure. It's an old-fashioned measure of prejudice, which is the degree to which you would prefer social distance from someone who disagreed with you on this issue. It's been usually used for the degree to which you would prefer social distance from, say, ethnic minorities. So there's a variety of questions about how happy or unhappy you would be to have someone who does not share your views on this issue as someone who marries into your family, the owner of a store you frequent, the teacher of your children, move into your neighborhood, and so on. So let's see what predicted social distance in this case. Controlling for gender and age, as well as the characteristics of attitude extremity that I mentioned before, moral conviction nonetheless explains unique variance in social distance from those who don't share your position on what you see as the most important issue facing the country today. Extremity does as well. Importance and centrality are looking a little wonky. And then we replicated this and extended it, this time by asking about 4 researcher nominated issues and introducing some control variables. That maybe all this is about strength of political orientation or something. Or maybe it's just some people tend to see everything in a moral light and therefore don't like other people. So to test this idea, we control for strength of political orientation in a first step. It's missing a line there. It also controls for actually strength of moral conviction on the other 3 issues to predict social distance from a target issue. I'm not sure why that's not showing up. That explains, some variance, like correlation or beta coefficients in the range of 0.2 to 0.3. But controlling for all of that, you still do get some effects for attitude strength variables, but they are all over the place. Extremity is the most reliable predictor of social distance, but importance is having some negative coefficients, positive coefficients. Certainty isn't doing anything. But nonetheless, when controlling for all of that, you very consistently find that strength of moral conviction is predicting preferred social distance people want from people who don't agree with them on these target issues. Okay, which is providing some preliminary support for this idea that people are intolerant of those who do not share their morally convicted views. But it'd be really cool to get some behavioral evidence of this as well. Okay, rather than just getting self-report data. So we also did a study where we brought people into the lab and told them they're about to engage in a get to know you exercise. And that what we're really interested in is the how gossip or inside knowledge about who you're about to meet might affect how you go about getting to know someone. So participants were told that they were going to be randomly selected to be either an informed or non-informed research participant. They were figuratively asked to pull some information about who they were about to meet out of a hat. What they learned about the other person was that they were extremely pro-choice, the information that we gleaned from mass testing. And then they were escorted into this other room where they encountered a chair with a backpack on it, actually had a coat and a Starbucks cup on the floor. Somebody had obviously taken possession of this chair, but they weren't there. The researcher feigns dismay. Oh my goodness, the other participant must have gone to try to find the bathroom or something. You know this building, they'll never find their way back. And by the way, we have a neo-brutalistic building that's built on a theory of rotating squares. It is really confusing. I saw Bill Gay in the audience, she knows. So why don't, I'm gonna go try to find them and make sure they find the lab again. Why don't you grab a chair from the stack and make yourself comfortable, and I'll be right back. There were no other chairs besides the possessed chair in the lab, so the participants did have to take a chair from the stack and place it. The dependent variable in this case was the distance between the two facing chair legs. Okay, how closely did they put that chair to the other participant as a function of whether the other participant shared the perceiver's own attitude on abortion. And what we found is that when participants shared the attitude with who they thought they were going to meet, that when they had the morally convicted people about that issue placed their chair closer to that person than the non-morally convicted. Okay, which means that shared moral convictions does lead to an attraction effect. Similarly, or conversely, when people disagreed with the person's position on abortion, they placed their chair further away from that target when they were high in moral conviction than they were low in moral conviction. You might notice the distance between the bars is bigger for repulsion from an attitudinally dissimilar other than it is attraction towards an attitudinally similar other. And by the way, this interaction was robust to controls for attitude strength variables. So this was not explained by attitude extremity. There was some persuasive behavioral evidence that moral convictions are in fact intolerant. But I think this is the most persuasive evidence that we have of our intolerance effect, or the unique effects of, or that morally convictions are something unique and above and beyond strong attitudes. This was a study that brought people together in small groups of 4. And the groups were variably composed of to be attitudinally homogeneous or heterogeneous with respect to some issue. Okay, we had 3 issues: legalizing abortion, whether the death penalty should be allowed, and whether a mandatory testing should be a graduation requirement at our university. It turns out that the UIC student body is actually pretty equally divided on all of those issues. And it also turns out that attitudes about capital punishment and abortion are remarkably uncorrelated, and enough uncorrelated that we could get equal numbers of people who had moral convictions about abortion but not capital punishment, and people who had moral convictions about capital punishment but not abortion. Okay, they were randomly assigned to actually talk about the issue they had a moral conviction about or not, with the exception of the mandatory testing requirement as a kind of external control group. And all groups were told that their task was to come up with a procedure to decide once and for all whether we should impose restrictions or allow these things. Okay, they weren't supposed to decide the outcome. They were supposed to come up with the procedures. Okay, everybody came up with one or another version of democracy. Where they varied rather dramatically was with who got to vote. To the extent that they came up with procedures. This external control group, very few of our students actually have moral convictions about mandatory testing as a graduation requirement, but they felt very strongly about it and about equally divided about whether we should or should not have mandatory testing. So we use that as just an attitude strength control, even though we actually have attitude strength controls baked into the other part of the design as well. So then we let them loose to discuss their issue. They were given blue cards on which they could actually cast votes. When they actually thought that they maybe had come to consensus, they had to write down the procedure, take a vote on the procedure. But also on that blue card, there was an opportunity for them to select a box that said, we're never going to agree on a procedure. So they could actually vote to basically end discussion. So they could come to unanimous consensus on a procedure through this anonymous voting thing. They could hang, which is where if everybody unanimously agreed they're never going to agree, or they could time out. We gave them 30 minutes, which is an eternity in lab time, to discuss. If they hadn't resolved their issue in 30 minutes, we shut it down. We also took post-discussion questionnaires about how cooperative group members felt that they were in terms of really trying to come to some kind of procedural resolution. And what you can see is that the heterogeneous groups, those who had 2 people on one side of an issue and 2 people on another side of the issue, who were talking about moral mandate, something that they were morally convicted about, expressed the least cooperativeness with their group of all the other group configurations. And I should point out, by the way, that nobody knew what the group configurations were or what their group members' attitudes were prior to discussion. And then it was the ones who talked about mandatory testing, okay, who were equally hot about their issue, who reported the greatest degree of cooperativeness with their fellow group members, okay, or really trying to come to a solution. We also had third-party judges evaluate videotapes of the group discussions. One question was how tense they were, and you can see that the heterogeneous groups that talked about something that they were morally convicted about were dramatically perceived to be more tense than those in the other group configurations. And again, it's this external control group, the strong attitude group, who was the least perceived to be the least tense. And actually, just watching the tapes, these guys were having a blast. I mean, they were really having fun. They disagreed, but they were really engaged, you know, cheerfully engaged, and really enjoying the conversation. You can really tell that they're just really happy that they weren't doing another cognitive experiment. Whereas the ones that were in the heterogeneous group, I mean, it really was tense. They were really awkward, huge pauses between somebody would speak. They clearly thought that their conversation was pretty dangerous. We found similar patterns of results in terms of third-party evaluations of defensiveness. It's really, the heterogeneously morally convicted groups that were showing defensiveness in their group conversations, whereas none of the other groups were. The only case where the group composition, whether it was heterogeneous or homogeneous, didn't matter was how the group discussion resolved. Okay, that if they were talking about something they were morally convicted about, even if it was in a homogeneous group, they were the least likely to come to consensus of the procedure of any of the other group configurations. Okay, or any of the other groups, but it didn't matter whether they're homogeneous or heterogeneous. It's clearly these groups, the homogeneous groups were coming up like really wild procedures, really crazy bias, like practically limiting the only people who could vote were the people who agree with them. They still felt weird coming to consensus to say that, yes, I would accept this procedure as the procedure to decide once and for all this my particular issue. So we take this evidence coming from this study in particular as evidence that moral convictions are something unique from otherwise strong attitudes. The participants in these strong attitude groups clearly look different in a behavior way from the groups that we're talking about moral convictions. So are moral convictions distinguishable from otherwise strong but non-moral attitudes? And we would say on the basis of this evidence and other evidence that, that they are. So what are some of the consequences of having an attitude with moral conviction? Well, one of the key hypotheses that we had is that maybe people who have moral convictions are going to be more resistant to authorities than people who don't. And so this is basically testing whether there's a boundary condition on what's otherwise known as the fair process effect. Previous research had discovered that the more one perceives a process to be fair, the more one accepts and is satisfied with the decision outcome of that process. And it turns out that this is independent of whether the outcome is favorable or unfavorable or favorable to the perceiver. This is a really widely replicated effect. And this actually was what spawned my interest in moral convictions in the first place, was having an argument with Tom Tyler, who was a big proponent of procedural fairness, about abortion. And he said, you know, that the Supreme Court must not have been perceived as sufficiently fair to decide the abortion issue, otherwise it'd be fine. Whereas I thought, like, come on, we've got, 60 years of debate about the status of abortion, despite the fact that it was decided by a Supreme Court under conditions where the Supreme Court's legitimacy was seen as enormously high. And at least up until recently, the Supreme Court has been seen as one of the most legitimate government institutions in the United States. But notice that the fair process effect is about favorable and unfavorable decisions, and basically whether decisions serve somebody's self-interest or not. What happens when it violates people's moral convictions? Well, we took some pre-measures of perceived legitimacy, trust, and procedural fairness of the Supreme Court. Right before it was, well, actually months before it was to decide the legal status of physician-assisted suicide and whether states can legalize it or not. This was a challenge to Oregon's Death with Dignity Act. We also measured people's strength of moral and religious convictions about the issue. We waited around until the Supreme Court made its decision. And then took the same took actually outcome fairness judgments, decision acceptance, as well as the same measures of legitimacy, trust, and procedural fairness we took at time one. Just to orient you towards this graph, the x-axis is the percent variance explained. What you can see is, whoops, religious convictions did explain unique variance in people's reactions to the Supreme Court decision. People who were religiously convicted about the issue almost uniformly disagreed with the idea of legalized physician-assisted suicide. And so they perceived this as more unfair and rejected the decision. The blue bars are the moral conviction by support versus opposition interaction terms, which accounted for a little more than 8% unique variance themselves. Okay, this is controlling for strength of religious convictions. That if you supported physician-assisted suicide, you thought that the Supreme Court decision, which, by the way, in this case, supported Oregon's and other states' ability to legalize physician-assisted suicide, you thought the Supreme Court decision was fair and should be binding. If you didn't, you thought it was unfair and should not be binding. What's really surprising in here is in the red bars, I've actually got all the variance explained by procedural fairness, legitimacy, and trust on people's outcome fairness and decision acceptance. And you can see that they explained a minuscule amount of unique variance in this case. It didn't matter how fair people thought the court was pre-decision in terms of how people reacted to the fairness of the post-decision. Also, interestingly, moral convictions predicted changes in perceptions of the legitimacy, trust, and procedural fairness of the Supreme Court. You trusted the court or perceived it as more legitimate if it agreed consistent with your beliefs, morally convicted beliefs, and less so if it didn't. Moral conviction, interestingly, did not explain any variance in perceived or changes in perceptions of the Supreme Court. This is a really interesting test of the difference between beliefs that are rooted in convention. Okay, religious beliefs are very authority dependent in terms of obedience to what God says and religious authorities have to say. Moral convictions are not. And so The religiously convicted thought the Supreme Court as an authority was still equally legitimate, irrespective of how it decided. The morally convicted perceptions rose and fell as a function of whether they agreed with what the court decided. I wanted to quickly go through a vigilantism study. This was a study that participants read a newspaper article about a crime involving the murder of a young couple during a burglary. We manipulated people's moral convictions by giving them inside information about whether the defendant was guilty or innocent, okay, or didn't give them information. People who were given information about defendant innocence or guilt became morally convicted almost uniformly that the defendant must be convicted or acquitted, respectively. In both cases, the defendant dies either through a death sentence, which is a death that happens through a fair process. And we made sure that the trial procedures were decided as exemplary, fair, chances for appeal, and so on. Or he was shot and killed on his way to trial by a vigilante, which is a quintessentially unfair process. What you can see is that the differences between vigilantism and due process of law made no difference when participants had moral convictions about defendant guilt or innocence. It only mattered when we told them that people close to the case were very divided about the defendant's guilty or innocence, and therefore they did not have a moral conviction about what should happen. You might be a little surprised that the only small bar above zero on the fairness of a trial in that case. There is a tendency for people to presume anyone charged with a crime is guilty, which is probably why we observe that effect. But basically, morally convicted people really don't care about due process when they have a moral conviction about the outcomes that processes are supposed to yield. We've also tested some hypotheses about the motivational properties of moral conviction. We did this in the context of the debate about same-sex marriage, which was kind of an interesting time to actually test hypotheses because you could control for status quo. We had about equal numbers of participants who were supporters and opponents of legalizing same-sex marriage from states where same-sex marriage was legal versus illegal at the time of data collection. Our data was collected when some very large states had already legalized same-sex marriage, but it was before the Supreme Court had made a ruling on the case. So we also were able to test some hypotheses about whether moral convictions are really about harms and motivated by harms, as well as approach versus avoidance kinds of emotions. What you can see here in our regression analyses, that moral conviction and perceived benefits of one's preferred policy solution, anticipated regret at not becoming involved, and anticipated pride at failing to become involved were the only significant predictors of willingness to engage in activism on the case. And there were no interactions. In other words, that the results were not qualified by status quo or by political orientation. And you put this into a mediational model, anticipated harm dropped out of the model. Instead, people seem to be moral convictions seem to be about approaching one's ideal world as opposed to avoiding one's not ideal world. It's also pretty oriented in terms of personal judgments about wanting to avoid regret and to feel pride in one's activities. We replicated this, by the way, using concealed carry laws on college campuses. We also replicated this in the context of the Supreme Court making a decision about the case. I have, for some reason, really gone slow today. So I'm not making it as much progress through my talk as I normally do. So normally here I would go through a bunch of studies that are getting at testing hypotheses about where moral convictions come from. I can put up basically the theoretical models is that competing theories that maybe morality is more about gut reactions versus more considered judgments. And I can just give you away the punchline right now that our evidence is going much more towards, well, actually it's inconsistent with both. The intuitive approach implies that you're going to make judgments without much cognitive awareness. Our studies have revealed that in order to move moral convictions around, you do need to have cognitive awareness, and that in an area that's integral to the moral conviction that we're trying to move around. It can't be incidental cues, although it is very emotional. Okay, it's not. We're finding it's driven by strong emotional reactions and not by awareness of harm. We've done research also in the context of presidential elections in terms of what's predicting changed moral convictions over election cycles. What we find is that changes in enthusiasm change moral convictions about preferred candidates, whereas changes in hostility over the election cycle increase moral convictions about non-preferred candidates. And I'm sorry. And what you're not seeing, by the way, is that changes in fear, benefits, or harm were not changing people's attitudes. Okay, so perceptions of harm are consequences of changes in moral conviction, which is what this slide is about, not about harms or not about harms. You do, however, yeah, okay, the changes in moral conviction lead to changes in emotions and in harms, but only emotions are precursors of moral convictions. So let me jump ahead. We've also done experimental manipulations of exposing people to harm that's incidental versus integral to the target attitude we're trying to change. In this case, attitudes about abortion. And people were doing a word versus picture task in terms of what were you exposed to. People were really highly accurate in terms of whether they were exposed to pictures or words related to, but not necessarily as a function of varying presentation speeds, maybe couldn't necessarily report what they saw. But basically, people who were exposed to pictures of, so let's skip next slide. People who were exposed to pictures of aborted fetuses at these really fast levels, but at supraliminal levels of awareness, were the only ones who actually had changed moral conviction attitudes as a function of exposure, whereas equally bloody pictures of animal rights violations or pure disgust conditions at overflowing toilets did not. And a replication of this actually tested for mediators and found that only disgust mediated the relationship between exposures to those pictures and changes in moral conviction. So just a summary, harm is a precursor or post hoc justification rather than a precursor of attitude moralization. We are getting complex stories in terms of emotions leading to changes in moral convictions. We do get effects for disgust, which are predicted by the social intuitionist model, but we also get effects for hostility and enthusiasm. We do not get effects for fear. And can also quickly say that moral convictions are better predicted by people's personal identity concerns than their social identity concerns. And want to close with some normative implications and conclusions and to leave enough time for a Q&A. Based on these results, one could normatively argue that moral convictions are really bad things. They lead to intolerance of differences. Like, you don't want people to move into your neighborhood. You don't want to shop at a store owned by somebody that doesn't share your moral convictions. It leads to difficulty in negotiating procedural solutions to conflict. There's actually now tons of other additional evidence, including in bargaining games and other kinds of data, that people just will not compromise their moral convictions. The vigilante study, for example, is one of many studies that has shown that moral convictions are associated with blindness to due process and rule of law. People really don't care about the means by which people decide outcomes that are related to their moral convictions. They're only interested in whether their moral convictions are achieved. We've also got data that shows that when people have moral convictions, there's backlash against the legitimacy of authorities, organizations, and so on. that do not uphold their moral convictions. And people will accept violent means and almost any means to achieve morally preferred outcomes. We've got the vigilantism study, but we have numerous other studies where people, for example, are quite tolerant of lying and cheating to achieve morally convicted ends as well. So these just don't sound like great things for a functioning society. On the other hand, though, we also find that moral convictions yield the fuel that people need in order to become politically engaged. We found over every election cycle since 2000 that morally convicted voters who have moral conviction about candidates or issues are dramatically more likely to vote. And those effects cannot be reduced down to partisanship or other kinds of alternative explanations. We've also got lots of study about how they motivate people's willingness to engage in activism. Interestingly, they seem to be focused more on creating their ideal society than driven by their dystopian fears about their not ideal society. And people are willing, morally convictions give people the impetus to be able to fight to create change even in the face of extreme costs for doing so. For example, shunning by their peers and so on. Matthew Hornsey's done some fascinating studies in terms of people's willingness to write letters to the editor, even when they're given information that 90% of people's peers are going to disagree with them about it and dislike them for it. So it would seem like we would never have any positive social change if we didn't have a morally convicted populace. The Russian people, for example, yesterday and today, who are standing up in the streets despite high risk of being arrested in protest of the Ukrainian war, are a really interesting example. It's hard to imagine that those people are not morally convicted against the war. So the question about normative good and bad here really does seem to be whether the morally convicted are on your team or not. If they're the things that morally convicted people are willing to do in the name of their beliefs are going to be heroized to the extent that you agree with them. However, the same kinds of behaviors are going to be seen as functionally evil, if not deep, if they actually are at odds with one's beliefs. Think about the trucker convoys, for example, in Canada right now. Many people really did think that they needed to be removed because they vehemently disagreed with what they were taking a stand for. Whereas other people think that this is the laws that are being passed, for example, in Canada, are extremely incurring an extremely high cost for democratic protest. And probably the degree to which you feel like that the government is responding in a legitimate way probably depends on whether you agree or disagree with the truckers' cause. So I will end there just thanking my many collaborators. And again, sorry for kind of rushing through the end there. And want to open it to questions. Tanya. Oh, clapping, I see. Thank you. You can put questions in the chat or just raise your hand or jump in.
All right. Hi, everyone. So let's all thank Dr. Skitka for this wonderful talk. To handle the question and answer session now, please go ahead and type your question into the chat box, and I will sort of monitor those, and I will either read them to Dr. Skitka or call on you to read them out, and that's how we'll proceed. So go ahead and let's start with Michael Olson, who has a question about the groupiness of morality. Michael, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. And hi, Linda. Good to see you.
Hi.
Yeah, so I'm struggling with the groupiness of morality. So, like, in the way you've depicted it, sort of as you go from conventions to morality, you get less kind of group influence, and it becomes a little bit more identity, like individual identity driven. And you showed data that showed that, like, the identity of the individual is doing more work than the group. But like then when I think about like Alan Fiske's theories about morality, morality is very groupy, and it's about like group function and social roles and things like that, where, if it has to do with group function or group survival, then it becomes more morally relevant. So like on the one hand, I see your data showing that like morality kind of has this individualist bent, but then I see, Alan Fiske and others' views that it's very social. And so I'm just kind of confused about just like how much does one's individual versus sort of group identity either determine or is affected by the moralization of an issue. Do you have thoughts?
I do have thoughts. And at a couple of different levels, like my data really is showing, excuse me, passers by, my office is connected to my husband's office. We are not getting groupie effects at all with moral convictions in terms of compromise, in terms of doing Ash-like paradigms, a whole host of things. We just, just don't get the normative conformity effects and so on. But I think this is a problem with the looseness of our use of the word moral. We are slapping the word moral onto so many different things and acting as if we're talking about the same thing. So like what we used to call attribution theory has really transformed itself into being a theory of morality now in terms of how we make attributions of blame. It's a looseness with which we use the word moral is I think, a distinct problem, because I think we're studying many different phenomena under that umbrella. So what I'm studying is, again, specific attitudes and the degree to which people have a perception of morality attached to the given attitude, which I think is different than things like how people decide to allocate goods. Okay. And to the extent that I do have some thoughts on this is that there can be morality in the distributive domain, separate from the procedural domain, right? Okay, whereas the procedural domain is usually all about, wanting to be respected by authorities, want to be a good group member and so forth. But maybe that's not how fairness actually really works entirely, is that in order to avoid exploitation, moral convictions might have actually adapted to be, okay, I know the right answer on this one and I'm not going to exploit it by the group or the authorities. So I think we can have two things, kind of a social level of morality that is really governed by groupiness and that lives in the conventional domain. Okay, it's right and wrong by the conventions of our group. But then there's another kind of morality that is about personal identity, it's about conscience, it's about moral authenticity. And I particularly do see it as kind of a protection against the group and malevolent authorities, for example. That
makes sense. Yeah, that helps. Yeah, thanks.
Next, we're going to
Sorry, I should have introduced our new co-host for today. So I'm, of course, here with Tanya Lombroso as usual, and then Corey Cusimano is a postdoctoral fellow in Tanya's lab at Princeton. So anyway, welcome, Corey, of course, and thanks for managing our questions. Go ahead.
Of course, I don't have an ego, so I just wanted to get through the questions. We're going to hear next from Nora.
I think you have to allow unmuting.
I have.
Yeah, now I'm able to. Thank you. Thanks so much for organizing this, and thank you for the great talk. I think this is fascinating. I have a question on the notion of moral conviction, and I'm a philosopher, so apologies if my conception of these things are off, totally off. So the way you introduced moral conviction, I thought you're looking at the notion of morality as opposed to amorality. So, something being in the moral domain or not. And then there's also this other domain, which is morality as opposed to immorality. So it's something morally good or bad or morally right or wrong. So this other, like an orthogonal dimension. So I was wondering whether, and on both dimensions, you can have a gradient, right, between something being very moral or very immoral or very amoral or very moral. And now I was wondering if you're sort of in the middle. So if you think, for instance, that an issue is in the moral domain very clearly, for instance, like eating animals or abortion or something, but you have a sort of middle view. You think it's neither very moral, it's neither very good, but it's not, nor is it very bad. It's also not morally atrocious. Whether there's a connection to people having this conviction and having like the conviction that something isn't moral at all. I was just wondering whether you see a psychological, do you think that is like a categorical difference, or is there similarity? Is it even possible to tease them apart?
Let me see if I'm understanding your question correctly. It sounds to me like you are putting issues into bins of morality or immorality, right? Yeah? Okay, if that's true, I'm not putting issues in the bins of morality or immorality. I see that as entirely in the eye of the perceiver. Okay, so it's the perceiver who's sorting the attitudes into the bins of preference, conventional, or morality. Now, they might have an understanding that other people see some issues in a moral light, which I think opens them for the potential to be persuaded to see that in a moral light. But that even if they don't personally put it in that bin. Okay, so all the data that I'm showing you is about the degree to which people put it in the bin of their sense of personal morality. You can find effects just on, normatively moral issues, like the group tends to mostly define abortion as a moral issue. You can find some differences between that and an issue that people normally don't see it as a moral issue. I think it's being driven all by the preponderance of people who individually see it as moral. And I don't think it's necessarily about the issue at all. So hopefully that's answering your question.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and move through the chat because we don't have a lot of time left. Kara, will you ask your question about heterogeneous but non-morally convicted group condition?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this talk, and this was a rather minor point, but it just stuck in my head as you were continuing to speak, which was that you mentioned that, so I was really taken by the idea of a group of people with heterogeneous convictions, some of whom or who are not morally convicted, versus a group discussing a controversial issue, all of whom are more morally convicted. This was in one of the earlier studies, and the sort of the point you focused on was that the people who were morally convicted, it was a very awkward, tense, uncomfortable conversation. But the people who were not morally convicted, you mentioned that they seemed to be delighted to be having this conversation. And I was curious if you could speak a little bit more about that sort of double dissociation, or two different affective reactions to these controversial conversations about controversial topics, and if there's something interesting about enjoying this kind of controversy in a case where you're not morally convicted versus really feeling uncomfortable when you are.
Yeah, it's hard for me to suss apart how fun that was for the people, and whether it would have been fun outside of the context of having to participate in an experiment. Again, my department has a lot of, frankly, monotonous studies. So I think it may have been due to a violation of expectancies that they actually got to socially interact instead of just push buttons. So I don't know if that would have been if people would have been as delighted to talk about something they disagreed about outside of the context of the lab. But it'd be interesting to actually explore that.
All right, moving along, Eric Schwitzgable asks, how do you think about moral indecision? Can one have a moral opinion but feel uncertain about it?
Oh, that is such a fantastic question. As one, I completely understand the question, and I wish I had something profound to say about it, but I absolutely do not. Well, maybe I have something to say. But there's a psychological distinction, I think, between or an important psychological factor of moral recognition that has been understudied. And where moral recognition is being in a state of mind where something that was previously completely non-moralized to you, okay, you hadn't even ever considered thinking about it in moral terms. And something happens that you get moral recognition that it could be seen in moral terms, and that you have to deal with that. I would say that that's definitely a very cognitive route to having developing a moral conviction, because you're going to have to work at it and really work through the issue. This is a vegetarianism for a lot of folks, that until vegetarianism became more popular in the United States, it just never occurred to people that eating meat was bad. And so some of those exposures to those early documentaries about factory farming and so on led to a moral recognition. And because you hadn't considered that before, I just don't think there's a social intuitionist gut reaction way that you can get there. However, in order maybe to move off the ambivalence dial, what you might eventually have to do is recruit emotion to go along with your cognitive appraisal that, wow, this really could have moral significance. And so, for example, in the case of vegetarianism, you're going to have to recruit some disgust about meat. I think that's terribly difficult, especially when you've got, you know, a long history of hedonic value with that attitude. But another one that seems to be coming up, it's a fringe issue right now, but people seem to be increasingly getting a moral recognition about, and that's the issue of male circumcision in the United States, and how at odds it is with how viscerally wrong we think that female circumcision is. But it suggests in many cases that if you're starting from a point of moral recognition, you're going to have to go through a long process of evaluation before you're going to probably be able to convert that to a moral conviction. And I suspect you're going to have to recruit emotion to go along with it. But you might have to work at recruiting the emotion, given that it didn't come to you naturally when thinking about that attitude object.
Awesome. So because we're running out of time, I'm going to turn it back over to Neil and Tanya. Everyone else who didn't get to ask your questions, I'm sorry we didn't get to them, but we will save those questions for Dr. Skitka, and you should feel encouraged to reach out to her on your own.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for the wonderful questions. And also wanted to point out that this will be posted on for a month or so on YouTube. So if you go to the website for the talk series, which you all know because you came here, you'll be able to find some video clips up also of past talks. So thank you again to our guest, Linda Skitka, and thanks to all of you for participating.
I'm also willing to entertain questions at a future date if you want to just email me. So thank you very much. Pleasure talking to you.
All right, virtual applause. Thank you.